Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Insight with Beyond the Headlines and Political Tours. We've got a fascinating hour ahead of us, and by way of introduction, I'm going to read a few quotes about our guest. He's propagated lies and nonsense for years in an attempt to make a name for himself. He has got no interest in the facts. He is not a credible journalist or a filmmaker. Those are the words of Donald Trump and his company about our guest, Anthony Baxter, the documentary filmmaker. Welcome, Anthony. That's about as good an introduction I think a journalist or filmmaker could wish for at the moment. Where are you joining us from, Anthony?
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, I'm talking to you from Angus, the county of Angus in northeast Scotland, which is equidistant between Dundee and Aberdeen. And it's around 9 o'clock in the evening here.
Fantastic. And how far is that from Donald Trump's international links course?
So it's about 40 miles away. And I'm sure we'll get onto this, but that's really because I live locally here. That's how I became interested in the story initially, because it's literally just up the road.
Fantastic. Well, we'll certainly be talking about that in a moment. Look, over the next hour, we're going to be looking at Anthony's work from the past decade. A lot of it is about water. A lot of it involves Donald Trump. We'll also be heading to Flint, Michigan, where Anthony has been filming for the past 5 years. Flint and the water crisis there will, I think, play a key part in the US presidential election in Michigan this coming November. And we will be looking at that more closely in a moment. Once again, if you've got questions throughout the program, please write them in the Q&A box and that's below here. If you just look, there's a small section that says Q&A. And if you click on that, you can just type your questions in there. It means we can read them, I'll be able to look at them, and we can turn your microphone on, or if you want to, you can turn your camera on, and then you can put your questions live and direct to Anthony. Also, at the end of the hour, please stay on if you want to share your thoughts about the discussion. We do want to hear your views. But first of all, if you're not familiar with Anthony's work, we're going to play a trailer from one of his films. It's called It's a Dangerous Game, and I think it'll give you a flavor of how he works. Here it is coming up now.
300,000 roughly to join the club.
What people want here is security, legitimacy, they want quality.
Dubrovnik presented us with an opportunity to work in an emerging market.
100% privacy. Nobody can overlook you, never.
You need lots of water to facilitate golf, and we do not have much water around here.
Lake Las Vegas, the man-made lake, is filled with over 3 billion gallons of drinking water.
The lake has to be refilled every year.
Golf courses just pound water on them, and that drives the chemicals into the root zone.
Where is the clinical evidence? Not an opinion, an empirical assessment. Will you share it with the committee?
You know what? I think I'm a lot more of an expert than the people that you'd like me to hire.
Golf course number 2 is going ahead without any environmental impact statement being produced.
Wherever you see large-scale environmental injury, you'll also see the subversion of democracy.
You're dealing with a lot of corruption.
Why not answer the question?
Okay. I don't care about your... Why?
Mr. Blagojevich, why didn't you resign when you were indicted on corruption charges?
The question arises is what is the role of people in the community?
Trump out! Trump out!
Viewing that hypocrisy, that absurdity.
I consider myself to be a great environmentalist.
It just made it so clear-cut for people.
It was unexpected, totally.
If you're going to receive an award from your own organization, it kind of devalues it a little bit.
Who's going to pay if something catastrophic happens?
There's truth as you see it, there's truth as we see it.
I think we just need to pop a radio.
And I'm sure even my answers will be cut short and will be highly inaccurate. That's why I have a camera watching us.
I don't want to talk
about that. Not Bedminster today.
Because you mentioned about the environmental...
Don't you do that to me!
Great, thank you very much for that. There was a slight delay with the video and the sound, but I think we got a really good flavor of how you work and what you do. All the films have a social conscience. in the ones you've done in the last, a lot of them have water as a key theme, who has access to it. And you also look at the rights of ordinary people who are frequently neglected or trampled on in the process. The other thing is that you've built a lot of trust. You've built trust with the people you've filmed over many years in a lot of the cases of the films you've worked on. You've got a background in commercial news and radio. That's where I know you from some 20 years ago. You've even been a producer on Top Gear, which is a very different kind of animal to the films you've been making over the past decade. What I want to do is take you back to the film that we first mentioned at the beginning, which is You've Been Trumped, which looked at the development of the golf course very near your home. Can you just tell us a bit about how that came about, and also how that brought you into contact with Donald Trump? Because that was a frustrating process, which then was going to change over the next few years. And I think that's a fascinating relationship as well. So Anthony, just tell us how you first got involved with that and your first film.
Yeah, so I'm talking to you, as I mentioned, from Montrose, which is about 40 miles away from the course that Donald Trump was going to be building in Aberdeenshire. He said it was going to be a huge provider of jobs. There was some £1 billion of investment promised, 5,000 houses, a luxury hotel, and I didn't feel that it stacked up against the environmental impact, because this was going to be built on what was described by the scientists as the crown jewels of our natural heritage, these undulating, moving sand dunes, which are unique not only in Scotland but in Europe. They're supposed to be protected. In fact, they are a site of special scientific interest, as it's deemed in Scotland, and was supposed to be protected. Yet all the press was swept up in this, at the time, this big support of this development. And the only people who were objecting to it were local residents who were being pilloried by the press. And Donald Trump had chosen one in particular to make a case of, and his name is Michael Forbes. He's a farmer, and Donald Trump said that he lived like a pig in a pigsty, that his house was a slum, and he was standing in the way of progress. And in particular, the local newspaper in Aberdeen, the Press and Journal, was a huge supporter of this development, and was making Michael's life pretty hellish, to be honest. And indeed, so was the other media, because they were following suit of this agenda-setting newspaper in the northeast of Scotland. And so I just decided one afternoon to drive up to Aberdeenshire and to the site of this golf course and to meet a few of the local residents, because I just felt that although I had been working, as you mentioned, Nick, in radio and in television, and in working around the world in places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, doing work for the Aga Khan Development Network, making promotional documentary films, I had this interest in doing something of my own, which was a little bit more investigative. And although at that time I wasn't really setting out to make a film per se, it was really a case of just trying to get to the truth of what was happening. And so I went to speak to Michael Forbes, and to be honest, when you drive up to his farm, it's a bit intimidating. There's a big shed with the words "No golf course, no more Trump lies." And he kind of was there outside the house, and he gets so fed up with journalists just turning up that he has quite short shrift, and it takes a bit of getting to know him to understand that that's just really a surface act. Mm. And so speaking to him, speaking to the other local residents, I just realized that they weren't the people who were being betrayed by the local newspaper and indeed the local television stations. And so I felt that it was important to try and document what was going on from their point of view. And so the next weekend I took the camera up and I just started doing some filming. And so that's how it started.
Mm. I mean, how long did it take you to make? Because you filmed that over several years, didn't you? Before.
Well, Not actually very long, and in a way I was very lucky. I think at the time I felt it was a difficult project, but I had no idea that other projects would be much harder after that. And in many ways I was lucky because the residents who, certainly you mentioned trust at the beginning, and I think that one of the things I like to do is just, and you can do this when you're working on your own with a camera and you're just putting a radio mic on to a participant and there's only you in the room, you can build that trust quite quickly. And to begin with, it's a little bit, there's always that moment where you think, can I start filming, or shall I just have another trip of just talking to this person over a cup of coffee? But I did start filming pretty quickly, and the residents were just natural documentary people. I mean, they were just very human, very open, and I felt instantly really that there was something there to follow with them. And so I started the filming in 2010, and it was, I think, around May when Donald Trump, I just heard on the radio news that morning that Donald Trump was going to be in Aberdeenshire. And so I raced up in my car and blagged my way into the press conference. And he was there, and I started to film within the tent, and I actually got into the bit that I wasn't supposed to be in. And there and then I thought, there's something here that I think I could do that's going to be different. And so that was really the start of feeling that I could gather some material that other people wouldn't gather. And then also that the residents, meanwhile, I was discovering extraordinary things. Not only were their lives being made an absolute misery by Donald Trump's workers, security guards. There was a security patrol which would patrol around this development, and it's, imagine these sand dunes. It's a large stretch of dunes, and they're turning it into a golf course and the bulldozers were just arriving on the scene, basically. So there was that to film, but of course I wasn't officially allowed. They weren't giving me any access, so I would find areas where I could film, or vantage points where I could film the actual works. And meanwhile, I'd be racing around talking to the residents. And then there was one morning in particular where I was filming with Michael Forbes' mother, Molly Forbes, who's now 96. At the time, she was 86. And I had found out, had just had her water supply cut off by Trump's workers, and Michael Forbes, her son, whose farm building is right next door to her cozy caravan where she lived. And I felt like I had to go and get answers to that question of why their water had been shut off. So I went up to the Trump development office. And that's when the story really took a dramatic twist, because I, after that, went to speak to another local resident, Susan Monroe. Unbeknown to me, they had called the police, and I was then arrested on Susan Monroe's property, which became a real turning point for me, because I think then I felt that I had to make a documentary film rather than just an exercise of going to speak to the residents and trying to get to the truth.
It's a great film, and in the description we've just given it there, it may not sound like the basis for a documentary film, but what really comes out is this, as has been said in the reviews, it is a David versus Goliath story. You've got Michael Forbes, his mother, Molly Forbes. The water's been cut off. There are other people who are living in the area of the golf course who are really poorly treated. The Trump organization refused to talk to you, and you are arrested by the police, and you're put into a Scottish jail. And then consequently, the police have to apologize because there's no premise at all. There's no justification for this arrest. And what comes out there is the small people there being trampled upon, as I spoke about earlier. And it's a great film, and I do recommend everyone looks at it. And that in itself, okay, a few people have had their water cut off. It might not seem like a big deal, but it does really show you how the Trump organization at that point, you really don't see these people as very important and are very dismissive of them. And then they learn to take you a bit more seriously. And later you go and you make the next film, which is It's a Dangerous Game. And then the Trump organization begin to take you a bit more seriously. And this is what I'm interested in, is that Trump, both Trump himself talked to you and also Don Jr. as well talks to you. And I'm interested, they did grant you this interview. So let's bring, if we can, Isabel, if we can bring up that second clip. And I know we're having a bit of a problem with the sound, so we'll just have to bear with us. If it should be okay, but we'll bring that clip up now if we can. It's coming up.
You're going to do anything about all of these stories? This is just a small sampling that rated one of the greatest golf courses in the world, that rated, look, the world's 2 best courses. They're predicting the second course. It's a tremendous success, so successful that we're going to build a second course about 5 years earlier than we had anticipated.
Mr. Trump, you've made legal threats against the BBC when they showed the film, and you said it was defamatory.
Well, I thought it was. I mean, I thought that the tone of it was so one-sided. And one of the reasons I've agreed to do the interview is that there was nobody to speak up for our side. I mean, you only ask negative questions, and you only speak to the 2 or 3 people that were opposed to it.
You wouldn't let us speak to you. The police wouldn't let us speak to them.
Only because, well, the police you'll have to deal with. But the police obviously had a good reason for doing to you what they did.
But you've been accused of using the force.
I never spoke to the police.
The Grampian force, Anthony, is your own private security force.
I never spoke to the police about you. Nobody from our side was asked for an opinion or gave an opinion, whether they were asked or not.
They were, Mr. Trump.
Okay. But I'm sure it wouldn't have been put in. And I'm sure even my answers will be cut short and will be highly inaccurate. That's why I have a camera watching us, because I want that for, obviously, for certain reasons.
You've been accused of bullying the local people of the Many Estate, the local residents.
Yeah.
I thought, God, what like is that Trump people? They're horrors.
Well, this is a little bit like your documentary, Anthony. I mean, you show scenes like that, and it's very hard to counteract a statement from such a woman. She actually reminds me a little bit of my mother, if you want to know the truth. She looks like a lovely woman.
You pursued her for legal costs when she took out court action against you. You pursued an 86-year-old pensioner for legal costs. And how do you think that comes across, Mr. Trump, to people in Scotland?
Let's put it a little bit differently. We pursued Michael Forbes, and Michael Forbes was not fair to us, was not nice to us.
We see a scene of David Milne with this big bank of earth built next to his house.
Yeah, it's very simple. Are you ready? It's very simple. And I'm sure you won't put on much of what I say, but that's okay.
So what did he say? He then went on to say about, what was the last thing there?
Well, he went on to say David Milne has a house that's very unattractive. And as you can see, he built this massive bank of earth next to not only David Milne's house, but next to Michael Forbes's farm, Susan Monroe as well. In a way, he was a precursor of the Mexican border wall that he would then fight as an election campaign on.
He just didn't. They were blots on the landscape. He didn't want to see them, on his beautiful, picturesque golf course.
That's right. He didn't want his millionaire guests who were paying huge sums of money to play golf on this golf course to see these houses that he said were ugly. And in one little part of that film as well, in You've Been Trumped, he says that he wants to get rid of one house completely. And that was David Milne's house, whose mound of earth you saw there.
I'm interested that he actually gave you an interview, and just tell me a bit about that. Why did they decide to engage with you? And I mean, in a way, we've seen Trump speak at rallies, and we see the appeal he has to ordinary people in the United States, including places like Michigan and Iowa. So we've actually seen him sort of do his magic. When you met him, how was he? What was that interaction with you then?
Well, he was perfectly charming on one level. I mean, as you mentioned, he hadn't engaged with me at all in the making of the first film, and then suddenly that changed. And it came about because BBC Two showed You've Been Trumped on a Sunday night. It had a very large audience, and there was a big backlash against the Trump organization over their treatment of the residents, because up until that point, people hadn't really been aware that these residents were being bullied and harassed in the way they were by Donald Trump and his security staff. And so when that was aired, there was a big swell of support, and the Trump organization and Donald Trump himself was aware of that. And so he had, incidentally, tried to stop the BBC from screening the film. He threatened to sue them the weekend before the weekend of the broadcast. But thankfully, they did go ahead with it. And so following that, he heard that I was planning to make a second film. But at that stage, I was, as you saw in the clip of the trailer, part of that second film, A Dangerous Game, is set in different parts of the world. It's not only about the Trump development. It's about a golf course planned for Dubrovnik in Croatia, and also about a development near to Vegas. And so at that stage, it was a bit strange, really, because Trump suddenly changed. And his lawyer, George Sorial, called me up and said that they would like to meet with me, with Donald Trump Jr. at the Aberdeenshire course. So I went up there and filmed the meeting with Donald Trump Jr. and said to him, I'd like to speak to your father. And he said, I'm sure that could be arranged. And so it was very strange to go from this point of no access to, they were giving me suddenly access, wanted to take me around the Trump golf course in Jersey as well, in New Jersey. And so that happened. And then after that, I then went to interview Donald Trump himself. And up until the eve of the interview, he was the press officer, or his press officer, was saying that they would have to have full editorial control. And of course, we said we couldn't do the interview if that was going to be the case, of course. But the last minute they backed down. I did the interview, and it was a strange interview on one level, because it wasn't the film at that stage. We didn't have any backing for it particularly. Nobody was on board at all. And so I didn't even know whether we were going to get the money to finish the film, or indeed what it would actually be, because it was a strange one to be looking back at the way he had dealt with these residents for a film which was going to try and move the story on in many respects. And so he was, though, as I say, perfectly charming in the interview, but he kind of changed halfway through, where he starts to move from the man who sort of comes into the room and says, "Hello, Anthony, how are you doing?" After, as you mentioned at the beginning, he'd been tweeting about me and making all these accusations about me. Suddenly, that all changed when he walks into the room, and he's as charming as anything. But then during the course of the interview, it changed. And then after the BBC broadcast the film, he started tweeting about it as well, saying that I'd completely manipulated the interview, which was not the case. I mean, it was essentially, a 30-minute interview, and of course, you can't put the whole thing in the film.
Yeah. Well, I think what the great thing about that is that I like the fact that you've taken someone who's in a very powerless position, like Michael Forbes or Molly Forbes, and you're able to put those big questions to the people who authority, who have great influence over them. And the same with that golf course in Dubrovnik. I want to move on now to Flint, which is your latest film. It's been 5 years in the making. It was just released in the UK just in February, was it?
Yeah, so we had we had a preview screening at the Hamptons Film Festival in October, and then the actual finished film was at the Glasgow Film Festival. But we were supposed to be in the States in March in Washington, DC, Lansing, Detroit, Traverse City, and Sheffield Film Festival here in the UK. But all of those have been cancelled, of course, because of the coronavirus situation. So we're in a sort of a bit of a strange situation with it, as indeed lots of filmmakers are at the moment.
Yeah. So once again, the subject here, if you don't know about the crisis in Flint, it's a water crisis. I think this is a very important film. I think the crisis in Flint, Michigan is going to be have a lot of impact on the elections around November. Because I think it really informs people's views about the political class, if you like. and it's very much on voters' minds, I think, in Michigan, which is after all a key swing state. If you can just outline how you got involved in that story again, because again, I think it was a story that you stumbled upon again.
So I was in Michigan, in Detroit, doing a screening of A Dangerous Game, a free screening, and at the end of the screening, somebody said to me that I should go through to Flint to do some filming there because they had a problem with their water, and the theme in A Dangerous Game, as you mentioned, is water. And so I did. I had a camera with me and I went through there for the day, and this was in 2015 in July, and it was before the story hit the headlines, which was later that year. And so I was really the first filmmaker to start doing some filming there because it hadn't been on the news at all at that point. I mean, there had been some disquiet amongst local residents about the quality of their water, because just to fill in the story, so the state of Michigan decided to change the water source in Flint from Lake Huron, which was the water that came from the Great Lakes via the city of Detroit and was piped through to Flint. But to save a few $1 million, they decided to instead take the water from the Flint River. And although the Flint River is an incredibly polluted river, it was at least at that point, it's been cleaned up a bit now, it wasn't so much the pollution of the river that caused the problem, as people may know. It was the corrosive nature of that water, which interacted with the lead pipe infrastructure in Flint, because like a lot of cities in America, and indeed here, there are a lot of lead pipes under the ground that nobody really knows about because they're not disturbed. But when they're disturbed, then there's a huge, massive health issue. And so there was all these big particles of lead floating around the system, pouring into people's homes, toxic waste levels of lead. And when I went there, that was already happening, and the residents were jumping up and down. They didn't really know at that point about the lead. What they observed was the filthy look of the water coming out of the taps, and also the smell of it. And so this was water that was coming directly out of the Flint River and processed by this water treatment plant, which wasn't up to the job. And the local residents got a scientist from Virginia Tech University to come through to Flint to oversee a study of the water. And that happened almost immediately after I got there. And that study is what then led to the massive news coverage of the story, because it showed that the lead levels in many Flint homes were way above the health, the safety limit. And so also a pediatrician from the local children's hospital did a study showing that since the switch to the Flint River, the lead levels in children have gone up considerably. And I began filming then in 2015 and continued on. And after the cameras essentially left, which was in 2016, I just felt it was important to try and continue to document it, because partly because of this huge lack of trust that then enveloped the city, really, because nobody knew who to trust. They were then being told by the state that the water was safe, because by that stage, they had changed back to the original water source of Lake Huron, but the damage had been done and there was still a lot of lead in the system. But also, on top of that, there was a big Legionella outbreak in Flint, arguably the worst in American history. And that is also something that I was keen to try and get to the bottom of as well. So I continued on, and some films came out prior, obviously, to ours being completed, and this one was finally finished this year. And yeah, we'd hoped very much to get it out ahead of the American election, and still hope to do that. But it's a very tricky situation at the moment without the film festivals to have any kind of exposure for these films, to get them out and to get them into the public domain and into the public eyes. So we're working to try and get that done at the moment.
So once again, if you've got questions, please start to write them in the Q&A box down below here, and we'll start feeding those questions to Anthony. The crisis has been a very serious one, as you've noted, 12 deaths. And I think we've got a video clip here, and I think we're going to, we'll play that in just a second. And we're going to start, I think, with one of the experts you mentioned from Virginia Tech, who really sort of outlines how this has fed into this lack of trust in politicians. And again, we'll come on to that in a second, because there have been attempts at prosecutions, and then prosecutions have been dropped. And there's a real sense of betrayal among people in Flint. So if Isabel, we could just bring up that video clip, we'll have a look at that now. Amazing stuff there. It's worth, a lot of those complaints were aimed at Governor Snyder, who's a Republican who left office in January with term limits preventing him from seeking re-election. Very interesting to note that criminal charges were dropped last June against many of the people who were initially indicted by the state, and Michigan saying that they will actually they're going to indict more people again. It's just that they don't think that the basis for the cases were well thought out. So it's really an ongoing crisis. There's a real loss of confidence in politicians. So I've got, as people submit their questions, I want you just possibly to talk about that loss of faith in the political class. And then I've got another question for you about a filmmaker defending the little man, if you like. And so just talk about the political climate first of all, and then I'll come back at you.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, Flint is like the coronavirus situation, and the coronavirus situation is Flint on a massive worldwide scale, because we've seen that here in Britain, where people have just lost trust in their politicians. They don't know whether they're being told the truth. You have somebody like Dominic Cummings, our Boris Johnson's right-hand man, in the dock at the moment. And in Michigan, it was, as you mentioned, Governor Snyder, who just seemed to be covering up the whole time. Nobody trusted him. And so if you have a man like Snyder, one moment telling you that the water is safe, even though there was no real evidence to back that up, and the scientists are disagreeing over whether the water is safe or not, there is this vacuum of mistrust created. And so what the film then goes on to explore is there is Mark Ruffalo, the actor, has a non-profit organization called Water Defense, which comes into the city and says that it's finding all kinds of other things in the water that aren't being documented and reported to people. So the people feel they then want to trust Mark Ruffalo, and they want to trust his chief technology, or chief scientist, as he was called at one stage, even though he had no scientific qualification. And they want to trust him and believe the things that they're being told by Mark Ruffalo's organization. And as we've discovered in the film, that trust is misplaced also. So there's this real problem of mistrust. And it's not just in the politicians, but it's also in people who can sometimes come into that vacuum that's created when all trust breaks down.
So just to highlight the point of that, as a result of, I think it was Scott Smith's work, did he say that the water wasn't safe to shower in? Was that right?
That's right. And people had reported, and indeed I'd seen people with very severe issues with showering in the water. I don't think anybody disputed that there were problems with showering in the water, because, I mean, I stayed in Flint over 5 years within the water system. I never personally had any experience of it, but people had photographs of rashes, they had pictures of hair falling out, and that wasn't caused by the lead, that was caused by other contaminants in the water. But what Water Defense was doing was going into people's houses with this testing method, which was not proven at all. And so it was a bit like Donald Trump standing up and saying that if you inject yourself with Dettol, you're going to ward off coronavirus. There was no scientific evidence that this testing method was factually accurate at all, and so people were just having been lied to for so long by the people who they were told they should trust, the politicians and indeed the scientists, the state. They were left in this position of just feeling completely and utterly let down. But they have, I think that it's important also to stress that the state did so little to help the people. There was no big federal response, as you might imagine. There was no ripping up all the pipes and replacing them. Some of the pipes have been replaced, and the mayor, the African-American mayor of Flint, Karen Weaver, who came in after, she's actually no longer in the mayor's office, but she, I think, did a very good job myself in terms of trying to rebuild that trust. And with a program of pipe build replacement, which she was really cash strapped and had not the funds because there's no federal support. And so the people really are the big losers. What they have had is a few bottles of water over the last few million bottles of water, obviously, but nevertheless, just bottles of water. That's all they've been given. And there is still a huge distrust in the water. I mean, if I go to Flint today, I don't drink the tap water, even though I'm told it's safe.
Yeah, so we've got some good questions coming up. If we could bring up Marty Ryan's microphone, if Marty's there and happy to have a microphone turned on, we'll take a question from Marty. While we're getting Marty up, I'll ask Anthony a question. Marty, you're there. Marty, do you want to ask your question? Go on, far away. If you just, there we go.
Yep, I'm here. In the United States, I have a friend from Flint, Michigan, so I've heard firsthand about that. I'm absolutely not a fan of Trump, so I'm not at all surprised of the experiences you had. My question, though, is for those of us in the U.S., where would we be able to view your films?
Well, the You've Been Trumped, I think, is pirated on YouTube, so just watch it up there. A Dangerous Game, I think, is available through iTunes and through the usual, Amazon Prime, etc. Flint, we've yet to find a distributor for, and You've Been Trumped too, which was a film we released just ahead of the last election in 2016. We really struggled to get that film out to an audience. We had a theatrical release planned across the States, but then the Trump organization threatened to sue any cinema that showed the film. So we did a Facebook Live event before the election, but we're hoping to try and get that film out more widely ahead of this election. And that's really a follow-up to You've Been Trumped, which shows how the situation has indeed not improved for the local residents over the 5 years that was in between the time when I made the first film. So thanks, Marty, for your interest, and I'll certainly through Nick, let you know when Flint is available to be seen more widely. But hopefully also once the virus situation allows us, we can get it out at least at film festivals and screen it that way. But it's been a real problem to try and work out what's going on. But certainly with the other films, they should be widely available.
It's certainly a very tough environment to be, trying to launch anything like a film, an audience. That's, I feel.
Well, and especially when you have the Trump organization not wanting to have anything viewed or said or documented that puts him in bad light.
No, that's right. That's right. And I think it's important we try and get particularly You've Been Trumped too. It'd be great to try and get that out more widely seen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marty.
Thank you, Marty. Do stay on for later, and we'd love to hear your views when we continue our conversation in about 20 minutes time, when we have a discussion after the hour. I've got a couple of very pretty specific questions, which Anthony, I hope you can answer. One from David Jarvis and one from somebody called Anonymous Attendee, which I think I will ask their question for them, since I think it implies they don't want to have their microphones turned on. So let's get David Jarvis lined up. While David is being lined up, Anthony, I've got to ask you this question. You're a campaigning journalist, effectively. You're campaigning on behalf of the small people, the people who don't have access to power, the people who can't really get their message heard. And I get that. But I mean, to a certain extent, that really makes you sort of party pre. You are somebody who has an agenda. How do you deal with that?
Well, I don't really see myself as a campaigning journalist at all, really. I do see myself as the whole point of journalism, I think, is to allow people whose voices aren't being heard a platform. And it's not, often people say, I wanted to give this person a voice. It's not about giving them a voice, because they already have their voices, but they're just not being heard. And so I think that's the whole point of journalism. And so you have to be able to bring those very, very important voices to the fore and allow them to be presented to the people in power, so that you can try and get to the truth of what's going on. And so I just see that as the real thing. It's just about a feeling I've always had that is the whole point of being in this business. There's no, if it's just about interviewing politicians, it wouldn't be of interest to me, because I think it's only through spending time with residents at the heart of a story, or whoever it is, that you really begin to get a grasp of what the real story is. And that's the role, really, to then be able to put those points directly to the people in power and the decision makers.
Okay, and I'd love you to talk in a second about how you think the crisis has shaped people's attitudes towards politicians, but also, are people going to vote in Flint? People going to, if the people who are jaded with those in power, I mean, that's quite a critical issue in Michigan at the moment. If you don't take part in the vote, really that's people who are probably more likely to vote for the Democratic Party. That has big implications for the election. So that's something I'm interested in. David Jarvis, you've got a pretty specific question as well. David, do you want to ask your question now? David. I think you need to open your mic. There we go, David, there we go.
Mr. Baxter, I was wondering, did you do any investigation with the Detroit Water and Sewage Department, which later became the Great Lakes Water Authority? They were going through a great organizational and financial upheaval around that time of the city of Flint water crisis.
No, I didn't, David, to be honest. There were so many different tangents and roads I could have traveled with this story, and other people have done some investigative work on some of the other issues. I think what I felt was very much to stay with the residents and to really follow their plight over a period of time. So the main characters of the family are the families and the residents in Flint itself. There is some of me questioning the Republican governor, Rick Snyder, and then also following up on this vacuum of trust, and the other Professor Mark Edwards, who you saw there in the film. He ends up suing one of the local residents for, in an extraordinary twist in the story. So there's various ways. I feel I've got, with 400 hours of footage, there's already enough material to make a series, and the film itself is 2 hours long. But I think it's an interesting area that you raise, and one that I would be fascinated to have spent more time delving into all aspects of this story, really. But it just wasn't possible for me to do on my own.
David, I think you had another point. You said that General Motors had left Flint because of the amount of pollution that there was in the water system. Is that right?
Nicholas, what I was saying was that at one point, General Motors, in terms of their Buick City plant in Flint, left the city of Flint water system because the water quality was detrimental to their manufacturing operations. And I was wondering if Mr. Baxter had any thoughts about that.
Yes,
especially why it wasn't more impactful on bringing urgency to the solution.
Yeah, you're right, David. It was an appalling situation where the corrosive water that the city of Flint moves onto, as you say, was corroding the car parts that General Motors on their production line. And so, as you say, they switched back to the original water source. Meanwhile, the whole city was being fed the poisonous water. So it is in the film, that twist in the tale. It isn't gone into in any great depth, but it's another example, really, of how ordinary people, a company of the size of General Motors was able to move back, but the ordinary people were not.
I mean, and also the idea that it's too corrosive for car parts, but fine for you to
Absolutely. It's just appalling.
Sheila de Balaguer's got a good question. If we can bring Sheila up there. If we can bring Sheila up, that'd be great. Do ask more questions. Sheila, go ahead.
I just simply asked whether Donald Trump has actually commented on the Flint water crisis and what he said.
Yes, he did early on. He came to Flint during the 2016 campaign. And in fact, I had a bit of that episode in You've Been Trump too, because I was in Flint and I was sort of torn between the two films at the time. But Trump came in and to begin with, he said he had no comment to make at all on Flint. That was early on in his campaign. And then he came through to Flint and was given a very, very boisterous reception by the residents, who had a number of people at the water plant where he went to visit, protesting outside, saying that he wasn't welcome. So it was a close call, obviously, in the 2016 election between the result in the end. But Trump basically, I forget exactly his words, but they were the usual the words that he spoke at the time of his 2016 visit were certainly not ones that he's followed through on, let's put it that way. There's been no federal support whatsoever for the people of Flint since he came into the White House.
But Anthony, I think you've touched on a really interesting point there, which is, I mean, also Barack Obama went and visited Flint, and he made a speech in which he asked for a glass of water, asked for a bottle of water. And I think that's in your film as well, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. He asked for a glass of water and says that it's filtered. But the people of Flint, that was a real gut-wrenching moment. And hopefully it comes across in the film. I know it's been documented in Michael Moore did a bit on that as well in Fahrenheit 11/9. But yes, I think for the African-American community, particularly in Flint, who were delighted when Obama finally came through to visit. But when he went onto the platform and was talking to the hundreds of people in the room and took a sip of the Flint filtered water, saying it's okay because it's filtered, people just felt they'd been whacked in the stomach, basically, and felt that they'd been hugely let down. I think he just misread the public mood. And, one of those moments, really, I think he probably would be fascinating to ask him whether he regrets it. But I would imagine he probably does, because it was a moment of real...
It looks like an accident. It wasn't, he was not calculated in any way. Or do you think he was actually...
Well, I think it was a calculated decision, because he had already met, as we show in the film, he'd met with the plumbers union and other people in Flint as well, and had some filtered water, had asked to raise a toast with the filtered tap water. And Harold Harrington, who is in the film, who's from the Flint Plumbers Union, declined. He said, "I don't want to take part in a toast with the filtered tap water," because what he wanted was federal money to come in and help fix the problem. But that federal help never arrived, and so there was I think although he says when he's on the stage in Flint, Obama says this isn't a stunt, I think it felt very much the people that it was a pre-planned thing.
Which year was that? When was that?
That was in 2016, I think, in May 2016.
Yeah. Okay. So before the when he was still president, before the election.
Yes, exactly. Yes, but he was late coming. He didn't come for a while, and I think people felt let down by that as well, because Hillary Clinton had already been in. I don't think Trump had been to Flint by that stage, but certainly there was a feeling that from the residents, they wanted to see him there far, long before he arrived. Bernie Sanders had been through, I think, as well.
Let's bring up Fran Hoffman, because I think, Fran, you've got a point that really relates to what Anthony's talking about, what we've been talking about. And then after Fran, we'll take Nigel Harley. We've got about 8 minutes left. So Fran Hoffman and then Nigel Harley. Fran, do you want to go ahead now? Fran, do you want to go ahead? I think you'll just have to, I think you may need to.
I got it.
Yeah, you go. There you go.
Yeah, thank you. I've been listening with interest and trying to think through your interesting opening question about the impact on the upcoming election. It feels to me there's a narrative in the United States now around the pandemic about the disproportionate impact of the pandemic and disasters like it on communities of color. And the Flint story is absolutely a story of disproportionate impact on a community of color. So the race issue looms very large. And my hope is it's a motivator for political action. I don't know. And I'm interested to know if you all have thoughts on the ways in which framing this as yet another example of issues that make so vivid the inequality and racism of our country.
Okay, let's take Nigel's question as well off the back of that, because I think the two they go together. Nigel, do you want to ask your question as well, Nigel? Nigel Harley. No, maybe Nigel hasn't got his microphone. We'll come back to Nigel just in a second. Anthony, just deal with Fran's question first, and we'll come back to Nigel.
Yes, I mean, it is appalling. I mean, it was often said by people, Hillary Clinton would say, wouldn't she, said when she came through to Flint, that had this been a wealthy part of Washington, D.C., the problem would have been fixed. And that certainly struck me, having filmed there. However, it's also important to stress, I think, in Flint that although it is a majority African-American, it's quite narrow, that majority. There's actually, I think it's something like 53% African-American, 47% white. And what struck me is that this Flint situation, the Flint water situation, just struck both sides of, the African-American community and the white community in Flint were struck in equal measures, really. Now, obviously, the poverty aspect of it is the thing that is really galling, and the fact that, as you say rightly, Fran, with the coronavirus situation as well, it just seems to be impacting again on the poorest people. In our societies, and wealthy people can ride through these storms, and indeed in Flint, wealthy people could go out and buy and they would be white people by and large, be able to go and buy up lots of bottled water because the state wasn't giving any bottled water out to begin with. It would only give out a few bottles of water a day to an entire family of, say, 8 people. So it was just an appalling situation, but it was really just a desperate, just desperate to see it impacting on the poorest and most vulnerable people in society, and that does seem to be playing out again. I know it's not a very hopeful situation, and I just, I find it tragic to observe it, but you just don't know how else to respond other than try and show in these films and try and get that story out so that people can really see the impact over a period of time.
I'm just gonna, Nigel, we're gonna take Nigel's question in just a second. The microphone problem has been resolved. This has come up fairly recently. This was in April. You had the prosecutor, the Attorney General, who took over, who was changed last year, announcing that they will be producing more charges soon. But that was after charges being dropped against about 50 people last year. So obviously people in Flint tremendously disappointed, but this is a new...
The amount of money that initial case cost, millions and millions of dollars, and it's just appalling. I mean, it's gone nowhere. And the people of Flint have had no answers. So yet again, they are the losers in this situation, not seeing anybody held to account.
Nigel, your question.
Yeah, I think it's probably been partly answered, but do you feel the situation that's taken place in Flint will resonate, and more critically, do you think it'll resonate among those critical swing states, the neighboring states and that? I mean, despite obviously your best efforts, Anthony, in trying to, publicize this thing, but obviously it's a critical state, and one just hopes that it doesn't get forgotten in the coronavirus and all the other things that are going on at the moment.
I know, and it's it's really in danger of being overshadowed in many respects by the coronavirus situation, of course, but what I think is also terrible when you look at what's happened in Flint since the coronavirus situation. 3 of the pastors who were the African American pastors who were very at the forefront of the Flint water disaster, their lives have been claimed by the virus, and I think it's really important that that was part of the reason we really wanted to try and get the film getting some momentum at these festivals. I mean, in Lansing, the plan was the festival there, the Capital City Film Festival, was going to be busing through 2 busloads of Flint residents for free, and then we were going to do a screening in Flint, and the Michigan governor was slated to attend, and trying to get a little bit of traction through these festivals and through Q&As and through events, and keeping the story in the public eye. And I think that was really what I was hoping to be able to do with the film, to try and keep the story in the public eye for this election year, because I think, Nigel, you're right, it's just really important that it's not forgotten. And the people are still suffering. The problem is not fixed. The pipes haven't been replaced, and the people of Flint are still remain the big losers in all of this, and they have the virus to contend with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Anthony, if we've got more questions here, so I know the hour is up just now, but if we can plead with you just to stay with us for
I'm happy to.
a few more minutes. We've got more here. Jim Lernstein has got a good question here, which really sort of picks up on the idea of, do your films have lasting impact? Do they deliver the change? I mean, you've suggested here in Flint that it's you're making people's voices heard, but it's yet to have that impact. Jim, you've got a question that relates to, the earlier films that you've made. So if we can just bring him up now, I don't know if he's still there. He may not be on, in which case I may ask his question for him. Jim, I think you've just come up now. Jim, you can hear us, I can hear you if you just unmute your microphone, and you should be able to ask the question. Silence there. Can you hear us, Jim? I'll Jim, there we go. You go ahead. Far away.
2 questions. Did Trump ever use the film that he took of your interview? And the second question is, what is the attitude of local authorities now about this golf course?
Well, the answer to the first question is he tweeted saying that he was going to release the whole film, but he never did. And the second question about the golf course, the Trump organization has been given planning permission to build a second golf course. And I mean, it's just astounding, really, because in this is the one in Aberdeenshire, in this latest twist of the saga, there were only 3 people who were in favor of the second golf course and thousands of locals against it. But it's still been given the go-ahead, and this is by the local planning department of Aberdeenshire Council for not just the second golf course, but a big housing development, luxury houses for wealthy people, destroying yet more of this really kind of important dunes land. I don't know whether, beyond the virus situation, whether that will impact. Maybe these plans will be put on hold. But certainly the plan is at the moment that the development, even though it loses a lot of money, and this isn't me saying this, I mean, it's down to the company accounts. You can go online and go through the Trump International Golf Link Scotland accounts on the company's house registrar and see how much money they lose on it. Yeah, the plan is to expand it. I think one thing, though, I do think that the film has had an impact on other developments, because there was one further up the coast where another very wealthy organisation was planning to build a golf course on a rare stretch of coastline. And the Scottish government, unlike in the Trump case, where they called in the planning proposal saying that it was in the national interest of the country, which was just nonsense, because it was based on these bogus figures that the Trump organisation had put forward, claiming that it was going to be bringing all these jobs.
But just to pick up on that point, normally a planning application would be dealt with by the local council, and then this was taken away from the local council and put in the hands of the Scottish government. Is that right, Anthony?
That's right, yes, exactly. So the Scottish government has the power to pull in. It was rejected initially by the local council, but the Scottish government, led by Alex Salmond at the time, decided that it was in the national interest of the country that this development go ahead, which was just a ridiculous notion, because it was not going to be producing so many jobs that was claimed, and certainly the facts of speak volumes about that, because the jobs have not materialized.
What happened with the golf course in Dubrovnik? Because that was the focus of that was one of the points you looked at in the Dangerous Game. Yeah, that has not happened. In fact, actually, Nick, I can send you some of the protagonists in that film about a year ago sent me a clip from a local news organisation, but it was well done, bringing that story up to date. And they've been fighting the fight for years now. It still hangs over them, and it's this big golf resort which would be built overlooking the city of Dubrovnik, which would just be an appalling thing. There's no infrastructure for it, and the climate isn't friendly towards it, so all the water would have to be pumped up there. And the fear is that it would just yet again be a playground for the super rich, and the people of Dubrovnik would be the losers again. Mm-hmm. So it's a stunning area. It's also very, very dry. That's exactly. Quite well. Let's bring up Simon Jackson and Louise Tarrant, both of whom have got good questions. So whichever we can get to there. If one of those can just come up now. Have we got, because we're getting quite a few people on the screen now, I don't know which microphone we can hear first. So yeah, Simon Jackson, if your microphone is go on, Simon.
Do the recent antics of Boris and his chums incline you to make a film closer to home?
That's a good question. I mean, are you able to get out? I mean, journalists can go and film. If you've got a press card, you have the right to move around in this environment. Is there anything that you're interested in?
Yes, I mean, I think the thing is, though, certainly with the whole situation with Boris Johnson, I feel that that's probably not one that I would necessarily want to probe at this point, because I feel it's being covered so much in the wider media. But certainly other stories relating to the current situation we find ourselves in do interest me. What I'm doing at the moment, because I think like all of us really, we've been adapting to the situation we're in, trying to work out how long it's going to go on for, what can we do in the meantime, what's the best way of working. And what I've been doing is working on a couple of projects. One, to take the material of You Being Trump 2 make that film and updating it as a project proposal. So it's one that could be done quite easily without obviously having to walk out of this house I'm talking to you from. And then the other projects that I've been working on are developing a proposal for a series looking into major stories across Scotland, where but really done from the local residents and local people's point of view to begin with, and then holding people as and when to account if necessary. But that idea is something is just at a kind of early stage, but I think I certainly feel like I'm more inclined, partly because of the whole travel situation as well, but also it just seems much more appealing to me at the moment to be able to tackle things closer to home. But I must say the situation with Cummings and Johnson has it's struck me as yet again, particularly when you see how families have been fined for essentially doing what Dominic Cummings was doing. It's just, I'd like to say it's unbelievable, but the problem is now, of course, all of these things are not unbelievable.
Mm. Well, it's an interesting point. In June, we're about to publish our schedule for June, and we've got Andrew Tester, who's a photographer with the New York Times, and another leading international reporter here in the UK, and they'll be talking to us about what it is really like to report at the moment, both in terms of dealing with COVID-19, but also in terms of the restrictions the authorities are putting upon journalists in the supposedly to sort of protect the public interest, but also journalists do feel that their freedom to report is being curtailed. So that's certainly something that we'll be looking at in June. Louise Tarrant, Louise, you've got a good question here too. Louise, go ahead.
Thanks, Nicholas. My question, Anthony, comes a bit circuitously, and that is that in looking at climate denialism, it's taken very much from the playbook of the tobacco industry. And then when I looked at the tobacco industry, it came from the playbook of the lead manufacturers. And in fact, going back to the early 1920s, there was a case there was a whole range of hearings in the early 20s around lead, and General Motors led the charge. Despite having private research that showed lead had problems for people's health, they took the charge to protect lead in petrol, and that had flow-ons for things like manufacturing for paint, etc. So my question, I guess, has long historical roots, but so General Motors and others were complicit in the cover-up of lead for many decades, and so in the legal redress now, are they implicated?
No, they're not implicated. You mean a legal redress in Flint? They're not. Yeah. I mean, I think that the question you raised, though, Louise, is fascinating. I mean, I think the other thing I think which is interesting to me too is the fact that very little testing goes on these days to see the impact of, and we've heard this mantra from the World Health Organization during the coronavirus situation of test, 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 but very little testing actually takes place on lead levels in people, certainly in this country, in Scotland, where I am, and in the rest of the United Kingdom too. And I'm sure it's the same across the world in many other places. And these historical uses of lead, which you refer to, have an impact today. And so I think it's a very interesting area and subject area that you raise, Louise, and one that I think is definitely worthy of further investigation. But certainly the historical impacts of General Motors and what they've done is not part of the legal redress that has in any case fallen apart in Flint and having cost millions and millions of dollars already.
Well, Anthony, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you very, very much. We've really, really enjoyed it. Please stay online, everyone. You can join in the conversation now and share your thoughts about what we've been discussing, any aspects of it. Goodbye, Anthony.
Thank you, Nick, and thanks to everybody who took part. Really appreciate it.
Okay, no problem. Good to see you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye for now.